Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. Alicia here and Chris. Chris,
Hi,
good to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you as always. It's been so long.
You know, it actually has. I'm getting us up on Facebook now, and I was thinking it's been a few weeks since we've been able to do this. So I'm looking forward to it. And we have a really exciting topic today, which we're about to dive into and try to make kind of as much sense of as we can, and hopefully show you some of our favorite wines that we think you should try.
Indeed, it's somewhat of a complicated issue, and we're going to delve into what this might actually mean, this term of natural wine, which is, even to those who produce it, not always the clearest thing in the world, and certainly somewhat obscure to a lot of customers too, so it should be interesting.
Indeed, and there we are.
Excellent.
All right, one more second here. There we go. Okay, so we might have a colleague joining us here. So if you see a third face pop on, we'll introduce him. But as always, welcome back. My name is Alicia Barrett. I do wine education at Binny's. Chris Fear, our wine manager at our Willowbrook store, but all things to Binny's. He knows everything about everything, I feel. So again, Chris, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
As we dive into the world of natural wines, and as we mentioned in the description of this event, there actually is no kind of legal definition of natural wines, but it is no doubt a growing category across the world. There have been some producers that have been making these natural wines for decades, but let's not actually forget that some of these methods were kind of always how wine was made centuries ago. And so we're kind of drawing on a lot of history and a lot of kind of low intervention approaches to winemaking. And that's probably kind of my best explanation of it, is kind of from the vineyard all the way through to bottling. A winemaker is kind of having as little intervention on that wine as possible. And we're going to break down some of the words that you hear most often when we're talking about this and kind of help you make sense of those. But Chris, what would be your kind of 40,000-foot definition here of natural wine?
Yeah, I agree with your broad definition. It's a non-interventionist form of winemaking. And it goes all the way back to the growing of the grapes in the vineyard. You know, to be natural, you probably want to be growing organically. Although, because there are no definitions, people can turn out things they call natural with conventionally farmed grapes, which is complicated. But yeah, it's the avoidance of manipulating your wine. And in the wine world today, you have on one end of the spectrum, highly manipulated commercial wines that have all kinds of additives and things in them. And then you have natural wine where the person just stands back and lets nature take its course, including not adding sulfur during the winemaking process. So you're just letting it go. And then you have a lot of fine wine that falls somewhere in between, leaning toward the natural side without putting any weird things in it, but taking what some would consider very logical steps to keep their wine clean and safe from infection and things like that. So yeah, non-interventionist winemaking with organic growing.
So we have a lot of wines here that we're sharing with you tonight. So we're gonna jump right in. Chris, if you wanna taste the Vonda Days Blanc. This here is a wonderful wine founded by Brianne Day. She's the winemaker and the owner, and she founded this back in 2012. And it's still pretty small production at 6,000 cases, but when she first started in her first year, just made 125 cases of Pinot Noir. And this is now up in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. She is, though, making wines from across the state, so several AVAs kind of in play with other wines. And she, you know, got her passion for wine, traveling the world, going to various wine regions, tasting everything she could, and went back to Oregon and started buying fruit. And she buys grapes from only organic and biodynamic vineyards. And She kind of worked for some big names like Brooks and Ivory as well, so has that under her belt. And this wine here is a kind of an Alsatian field blend, if you will. We got some Pinot Blanc, we have Riesling, Müller-Thurgau, Pinot Gris as well. So I love the old world connection and great varieties that can do really well in Oregon, especially there in the Willamette Valley. So what do you think, Chris?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is like a Gentil or an Adelsvicker style. And this is no stranger to Willamette. I mean, people in the valley have been making this style for years. I think it's really nice. It's very, you know, as far as, you know, the quote unquote natural wine movement goes, which eschews filtering and fining and all kinds of intervention. It's very clear and bright and has a nice aromatic side to it, and good pear-like fruit. It's crisp, and I think it's really well made. And the thing about these natural wines is they don't have to be oddball wines that show unusual wine characteristics like high levels of volatile acidity and things like that. You can make a perfectly sound natural wine and make it very similar to what you would expect from any fine wine. I think the key is the final dose of sulfur at bottling. So most people who are making these natural wines will allow that if you go through the whole fermentation process without intervening, once you're ready to bottle, a very small dose of sulfur is acceptable, even in the natural wine movement. So, although a lot don't, and that's where, you know, you can go astray a little bit. But yeah, this is quite nice, very crisp and refreshing style, exactly what you expect from this kind of blend.
Yeah, this sounds like one that if you are kind of new to natural wines and just want to have a nice, clean, well-balanced example that is kind of really done responsibly, if you will, this sounds like a great wine to go to.
Yeah, there's really nice tangerine-like acidity to it too. It's definitely resonating in that kind of family of oranges as far as the citrus goes. It's very pretty wine. And I would say that, you know, I was looking at what Brianne is doing, and, you know, she's sourcing fruit, maybe not necessarily for this wine, but for Pinot Noirs and things from some very well-known vineyard sites that happen to be farmed organically or biodynamically. So, I mean, she's getting top-notch fruit and, you know, just working in this regime, which to me, a wine like this is not abnormal. This is what wine should be like. And yet it still falls into that kind of natural wine category due to, you know, just kind of leaving it alone and only the sulfur addition at the end. But there's nothing unusual about it as far as that goes. And it's quite good.
So before we get to the next one, I do want to talk about kind of biodynamics a little bit here. And we could spend hours going through this, and we don't want to, you know, kind of bore you too much here, but we do want to give you some insights as to kind of what this means and when it started and kind of the implications of it, especially since Brianne and most of the wines that we're having, you know, today source from or have their own vineyards that they farm biodynamically. And it's really kind of a step up, if you will, from organic farming. And it's a much more kind of holistic view. And this started back, especially in the early 20th century. A lot of farmers were noticing that kind of the quality of their crop, they noticed deterioration of their soils. They noticed lack of fertility in herds of animals and started asking some broader questions about these things. And they turned to the work of Rudolf Steiner. And it was based on his work. He was an Austrian social philosopher that a lot of biodynamics is founded upon. Maria Thun really helped develop it. And it's not kind of super prescriptive in that it allows each individual kind of some freedom to work within it and develop what's best for their environment, and pretty spiritual rather than kind of super, you know, rather than tangible, but it really seeks to kind of produce kind of this healthy living soil with balanced vines that are kind of in harmony with the earth and thus can defend themselves against pests and diseases rather than using all of the kind of harmful synthetic and chemical pesticides and so forth. The other thing I'll just add is kind of the important kind of cosmic relationship that it includes as it sees with other planets in the universe and the moon and the stars and so forth, that much of the work in the vineyard will be done on kind of these cycles and the moon, the lunar calendar in particular. Something that's growing, and while there are some skeptics out there for sure, those that do farm biodynamically continue to testify to its effect to produce excellent quality fruit. And even if they can't kind of exactly explain how using kind of some homeopathic type preparations and putting those in the soil, exactly change things, but it is bringing an energy and a vibrancy to the vines for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I fall in the middle ground with biodynamic growing. I think it's overall a positive, and it's very interesting because it's basically organic farming plus a kind of folklore, spiritual side to it, which is why a lot of people dismiss it because it seems like some kind of hocus pocus. But what I think that side of it brings to it is a sense of ritual and connection to the vineyard. So if you're prescribed to stir your preparation one direction 15 times and then reverse, or only attend to your pruning on certain days, depending on the phase of the moon, what it does is, in the end, it serves to focus your attention on the vineyard and keeping it in good shape, because you're following these ritualistic things, and the actual guiding principles, the moon or whatever, may not have any effect at all. But the real effect is someone who's very into their vineyard site and keeping it healthy. And the main thing is that idea of a single organism, that the vineyard, indeed the planet and the whole universe, is kind of unified into one thing. And you can't denude your land with pesticides and herbicides and have sterile soil and expect the vineyard to be necessarily healthy. There's so much that goes on. The more we learn about the role of fungal mycelium in conjunction with the roots of plants and just the way living soils with bacteria and things in them interact. If you take all that away, it's really to the detriment of your plants in the long run. And a lot of this, of course, it started with Steiner way back when, but a lot of it is really a big reaction to post World War II industrial farming techniques, where large petrochemical companies were, and still are, pushing all kinds of fertilizers and pesticides as the way to grow more, grow better, but if you have a dragonfly eating your pest rather than, spraying something on that kills the pest plus 30 million other things too, which is more beneficial to the vineyard,
Sure. And especially in these wines that we, said are not manipulated at all and have very little intervention. We need the fruit to be of the utmost quality because it's on full display in your glass. And so it is no surprise that these winemakers are turning to organic and biodynamic farming methods as the source of their fruit, whether they're buying fruit or, having their own. But again, not by law. And, within the natural wine movement, you'll still see kind of some others as well. But most, I think we can confidently say, are sourcing from these types of vineyards. So again, we could talk all day, but I want to move to kind of another kind of buzzword here in natural wine, and that's native yeasts or indigenous yeasts. And these are found, on the blooms, on the grape skin, and they kind of help start fermentation, even though they do start it, and some might, thus allow this to start the fermentation and carry it out. by the time you get to about 4% ABV or so, you'll get your stronger Saccharomyces yeast that come in and kind of dominate that. However, the argument is that you have more chemical reactions, more yeasts are involved when you start with the native yeast versus adding in a yeast strain. Thus, more chemical reactions, we get a more complex wine as a result. And so that's why they're generally not what we call inoculating. They're not adding in that yeast strain that will rapidly start fermentation, and it'll do so at even rates. It's easier to control. It's definitely the easier of the options, and one that you can kind of sleep well at night, knowing that you won't have a stuck fermentation. But relying on indigenous yeasts, yes, it adds great complexity and kind of adding to that sense of terroir, if you will, of that unique place.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of what we call terroir might be chalked up to the indigenous yeast and bacteria that are found in the vineyard or in the cellar of the producer. And it just stands to reason that if you are introducing a single strain of Saccharomyces after kind of denuding your must of anything active by adding sulfur, that it's going to produce something very reliable, but maybe not as complex, because Saccharomyces' main job and main goal is to eat that sugar and convert it into carbon dioxide and alcohol. Now, of course, there are all kinds of esters and things that are thrown off by any yeast, but like you said, in a natural fermentation or a wild fermentation, you have could be dozens of different bacterias and yeasts, things like Clechera or Piquette, and even Brettanomyces, that are naturally occurring. And yeah, the Piquette and Clechera will definitely kick your fermentation off, like you said, but they don't have the wherewithal to ferment out a wine. So you got to get that Saccharomyces taking over at some point. An interesting thing is these days, a lot of yeast labs are making blends rather than a single strain that you can pitch. So they're trying to kind of keep up with this idea of complexity. But yeah, there's no way to really replicate everything that's going on in a natural fermentation by pitching a yeast. And complexity is certainly one of the results, but the other possible result is things going awry, having a Brettanomyces take over and making your wine very barnyardy or earthy in an unpleasant way. And sometimes a little Brett is super interesting and complex, but a lot is, maybe not what you want. But yeah. It's other things too. It's lactobacillus and acetobacter. The natural arc of any wine, if you leave it alone, is its want is to move to vinegar at some point through the action of acetobacter. So that's one, some of the pitfalls of doing this, especially if you're working without sulfur. So anyway.
Yeah, and let's go ahead and address that big word there of sulfur that we hear so much of in our stores. People coming in and looking for low sulfite wines or no sulfur added. And but before we do that, let's do our next wine here. This is a very popular wine for us. This is from Weinklang in Austria. They're Gruner Vetliner from Bergenland. So this is in the very east part of Austria. And they too are sourcing all their Gruners from biodynamic vineyards on these kind of sandy loam soils. They ferment in stainless steel, really clean wine. I was surprised to read, actually, Chris, they don't use temperature control on their stainless steel vats. And then they'll do a little bit of lees contact for about 3 to 4 months with very rough filtration. And we'll talk about that later on. But you can still see, it's not perfectly clear, but it's still a very bright wine for sure. And we're kind of getting that because of that step of filtration at the end.
Yeah, a lot of people would eschew filtration entirely, but certainly fine filtration, but a kind of a coarse one is sometimes accepted. And the other thing that you mentioned is temperature control. The real hardcore adherents to natural wine would say you can't even employ temperature control, which is a way outside of sulfur to kind of tamp down something that may be growing a little wild. If you can bring the temperature down and stop it from doing what it's doing. But yeah, that's all part and parcel of it, is just letting it go naturally. Interestingly, I think Austria is one of the few places that has a couple rules. Like you mentioned, this is grown in Bergenland, and it is. But if you look on the label, the appellation is just broad Austria, Österreich. And that's because they don't allow you to be more specific when you're making a natural wine, which is kind of an interesting little tidbit. I don't know why that is.
That is very interesting. I wonder if they're not sure of typicity or something as it fits within kind of their DAC system. But yeah, I hope you guys are picking up that even within the natural wine movement, there's division and kind of infighting as well of those of, using temperature control or not. And to Chris's point, temperature control, especially when you're not using sulfur, is a way to kind of control those microorganisms that might otherwise cause some spoilage. As it gets warmer, it's a kind of a friendlier environment for them to kind of live in and impact the wine. And going back to kind of sulfur, that is one of its main roles, is to act as kind of an antiseptic. The other thing it does is an antioxidant, protects a wine from oxygen. And we see that kind of typically sulfur added at a few stages throughout winemaking, possibly a little bit even when you pick the fruit in the vineyard, and especially in through post-fermentation. And if you kind of don't use it and you do have oxidation happening post-fermentation, this is kind of one of the chief causes of a loss of quality in a wine. And excessive oxygen, can result in kind of this sherry-like flavor. It accentuates the bitterness in the wine, and you can have the development of the spoilage bacteria. So I say that to just not kind of think that all sulfur is bad. And I think we've kind of come to a place where sometimes our customers think that. And so just to say that we're not talking about, again, some of these like highly manipulated, mass-produced wines that might just be dousing it in sulfur to protect it. But we're seeing across the board, kind of natural or not, higher quality wines limiting sulfur use, and trying to do as little of it as possible. But just know that it does have a role, and actually it's a natural byproduct of fermentation. So we're always going to have a little bit, and they've been using it since the 17th century. In small amounts, it's very helpful to your wine's health.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. We're talking about measuring this in parts per million, and a few things that may surprise people is, again, it's allowed for the most part throughout the natural wine community as a stabilizer of bottling. They just don't like you tampering with the actual fermentation beforehand. And strangely, a lot of people tend to think that European wines have lower sulfur. You hear what we hear in the store a lot is, I went to Italy, I drank the wine all day long. It didn't make me feel bad. They told me it didn't have any added sulfur. And it's just not the case, number one. And number two, it doesn't have any scientific connection to headache or anything like that. It's just that we require labeling in the US to point it out. There's a small percentage of people in the world who have an allergy or a sensitivity to sulfur, but people who are getting headaches from wine or whatever, the only thing you can see on the label is contains sulfites. So that's the one thing everyone points to, but there's almost certainly no connection there. And it plays a very important role. And like you said, it's a natural byproduct of fermentation anyway. It's in your wine anyway. And the weird thing is, like, organic wine in the European Union is allowed to have 100 parts per million, I think, of sulfur added. That's not low. We're talking about, in the natural wine movement, people are looking at 30 parts per million, some even as low as 10 when they're adding it at bottling. And but you're free to add sulfur in organic wine in Europe. And strangely enough, the one category that doesn't allow it is USDA certified organic wine, which prescribes that you can't add anything. So that's where you see a lot of wines that have no sulfur at all. And it really affects shelf stability. And the idea of a wine that might be able to age decades is much harder to achieve without the use of some sulfur. But you know, it's not a bad thing. And if we want to really put it into perspective, the USDA says that if your wine naturally has less than 10 parts per million of sulfite in it, you can call it, you can say contains no detectable sulfites. So if some people are adding 10 parts per million at bottling and the USDA says that quantity is not detectable, you know, you might be adding it on top of 5 or 10 parts of naturally existing sulfur, but the levels are so incredibly low. Yet it's such an effective antioxidant and antiseptic. It's hard to live without it. Although I would say to make a wine like this Meinklang, which is very crisp and bright, and shows you a lot of what exactly what you'd expect out of Gruner, you have to use production methods that would be referred to as reductive rather than oxidative. So, you know, you're not going to want to put this into a barrel that has a lot of oxygen exchange, which is why the stainless steel is so good. You want to keep air away from it, because that's your only weapon against it is topping things up and keeping, you know, air away from it rather than relying on sulfur to help you out there. So
exactly. And yeah, on the Meinklang, this is an awesome wine. It has the characteristics of Gruner, as you mentioned. I think it's actually, the savoriness is there, but not kind of as much as some other expressions, not as much of that white pepper and kind of asparagus and chive. And it's, I think, a fruitier expression.
Yeah.
Stone fruits and some nice ripe citrus as well. But still, it's, and you get the lees contact, you can feel a little bit of roundness there in the mouthfeel, but I think it's a really, really fun wine.
Yeah, I agree. The nose to me is definitely fruity, lightly floral, and I do get an undercurrent of white pepper, but it's very mellow, round. It's not a sharp white pepper smell, but it's there. And yeah, it's really nice, crisp, easy drinking. I mean, I could drink this on its own or with a light dish for sure.
Yep. So again, this is Meinklang, Gruner Vetliner. This is $16.99 on the shelf.
Yeah,
so
that's nicely done.
Let's come back to kind of, we'll end with kind of the talk on fining and filtration here, and maybe in a couple wines. But I want to ask you, Chris, you know, as you've worked for Binny's for a while now and have been in the industry for quite a bit.
Millennia.
Who are you seeing kind of the leaders kind of today, and what regions are kind of stand out to you in this natural wine movement?
Definitely, it's huge in France for sure. And you know, historically, I mean, if we're looking at the roots of the modern movement, you can definitely look to Beaujolais as a place where it really took hold with a few producers in as early as the 80s. And again, you know, saying something like that is not to discount the fact that basically this is the traditional way to make wine anyway. You know, we don't want to make it sound like this is some exciting new discovery. It's ancient, and people are just going back to it and moving away from things. But yeah, there's a really strong push in that direction in Beaujolais, and you get a lot of biodynamic growing in Burgundy proper and Alsace and all around France. I would also point out in particular the Italian-Slovenian border, where you have people like Gravner or Radicon, working for quite a long time in this natural movement and kind of a subsect of natural wine, the orange wines that are made in that area. And of course, Georgia, not the state, but the country, that Eastern European country that has just a really deep history of amphora, Kaviri wine fermentation and use, and non-interventionist techniques. But you see it in the US too. I mean, it's happening everywhere. Without a doubt, people are jumping onto this. And again, it's a matter of degrees, you know, what people want to take from it. And I think that's true with a lot of things. And like you said, biodynamics is pretty malleable, and you can take from it what you like and kind of suit it to your own needs. And I think that's true here too. And until we really nail down universally what natural wine or raw wine means, you know, people are going to be doing a lot of different things. Yeah,
I wonder if we'll ever get there, because now that there are kind of so many people in the party, obviously it's harder to come to a consensus on that definition.
Yeah, for sure. I think in France there are like growers associations who are bonding together to kind of come up with their own definitions, and that's going to be the root of where you know, you go into government regulations. I think, ironically, a lot of the pressure to regulate or have a definition is coming from growers who see, or producers who see this as encroaching on their historic territory. So like organic and biodynamic growers who don't necessarily cling to every aspect of natural wine. They think that natural wine might be eating their lunch a little bit. So what is it? Let's define it. Let's figure out what it is. Am I that or am I not that? You know, some people might have been doing this for a long time and would vaguely fall under this category, but you know, because it's so ill-defined, it's hard to say who's natural and who's not. And if you can make something in a non-interventionist way out of a conventionally farmed vineyard and call it a natural wine, I mean, that's a fatal flaw, I think.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. But I'm glad you brought up the history, because it's, you know, it's not all just kind of 20-somethings making flawed wine in their garage, right? This has roots much deeper than kind of just the last 10 years when we've seen, you know, the start of the raw wine fair, which I don't even know when that started, but I only heard about it in the last couple of years. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's been around maybe eight years now.
Yeah.
I think. And even there, you know, there's, boy, her name escapes me. There's a master of wine who is kind of the person who came up with this raw wine thing. Do you know who I'm talking about, Alicia?
Yeah, the French woman who lives in New York.
Exactly. I can't think of her name, which is, I apologize to her. But even the raw wine is festival, she's kind of making the rules, you know, like, are you allowed to be in this? Well, do you do these things, that thing? And she might, from what I understand, you can get special dispensation to you know, chaptalize or acidify if you have a very bad year and still call it natural wine in the raw wine movement. So, I mean, who's to say? I guess she is.
Yep. And I forgot to mention this in the beginning, by the way, but of course, if you have any questions or comments as you guys are watching, please pop those in the Q&A or the chat function. So let's, you know, you mentioned France, you mentioned Beaujolais, and we're going to taste a Morgon, but first, let's have this Gaspard Gamay here. And this is, again, a very, very popular wine for us. I love the Gamay varietal, made as we see a lot of Gamay in semi-carbonic maceration. Very, very low sulfur added to this, so they are protecting it a little bit here. And again, native yeast, no fining, no filtration here. But we're going to have this Gamay next to then our Beaujolais from Morgon.
Yeah, so interestingly, a lot of people may not realize this because everybody associates Gamay with Beaujolais, but the place where it's grown most widely after Beaujolais in France is certainly the Loire Valley, which is where this is from. And it's not just, you know, for natural wine, it's a historic varietal for the region. And these guys, I think this comes from vineyards around Touraine, if I'm not mistaken.
This wine is delicious. It is bursting with fruit, but sometimes a criticism of Gamay might be that those that kind of don't like its kind of lighter body and more kind of delicate nature at times, but this to me is super textured, solidly kind of this medium bodied wine, really vibrant acidity, and you know, we're not getting kind of much tannin going on, but again, layers of kind of this brambly, dark red fruit that is so pretty. Lots of plums as well, purple flowers. Sorry, I'm not choking up with the wine, I promise, but it is fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely that kind of almost like candied violet in the nose, and it really does have a lot of texture. It's and there's no reason not to, you know, again, I don't want to make it seem like we shouldn't be expecting these things from natural wine, because we should. You know, although a lot of conventional flaws are accepted within this movement, and sometimes even, you know, that's what people are after. But there's no reason that good quality, clean wines can't be made under this regime. And this is definitely one of them.
Yeah, very much so. And for those that do enjoy Beaujolais, and I'm curious, Chris, as you taste the Morgon from Lapierre, what you think here in terms of how they kind of stack up and what the differences are. But yeah, don't forget about the Loire Valley with Gamay. If you are at home and you know you're a kind of a Pinot Noir drinker and you tend to like these more kind of refreshing, lighter reds, Gamay is a grape you should most definitely explore. And yeah, all the wines so far, one of the criticisms that Chris alluded to was just that people are making natural wines that are flawed, that have excessive Brett, that have VA, that have whatever flaw kind of that has come out because they're not kind of, they really are just kind of letting it go and see, they see what happened and bottle it and there we go. But all of the wines we're showing you today are really clean, beautiful expressions. And so don't dismiss natural wine just because you had really like one very funky example that you didn't like.
Yeah, I can tell just a really brief story about years ago. I was in Australia and visiting wineries, and we went to a winery called Akota Barrels, which is a guy who, was famously one of these rock and roll guys who played in a band and decided he wanted to make wine. And he unfortunately died this past fall, and he was very young, but his wines were beautiful and pure and really well made and had very cool names. They're all named after punk rock bands and stuff. But on the same day, we popped into a wine bar, and I'm not going to say the name of the producer, but there was a heralded pet nat sitting on the bar. They weren't even selling it. Somebody had brought it in to taste. And so I conned a taste out of someone, and I might as well have been drinking vinegar. And this is how disparate these wines can be. You can have something that has had acetobacter acting on it to the point where, and I'm not opposed to drinking vinegar. You give me a 100-year-old balsamic, I'll drink that all day long. But yeah, it was just out of control. And yeah, Brett can take these over really easily. And, especially if you're not using the bottling sulfur. That's where a lot of things are just going to go crazy after you bottle. It really helps to stabilize things, even in small amounts.
Yeah. So while you taste that Morgon and share your thoughts, that is, one of the main reasons to ask Binny's my consultant about some guidance in our kind of natural wine section that you see. We, don't have an official one because again, this isn't defined, so it's hard for us to kind of say decisively this is it. But they're all kind of clumped in around the organic section that you'll see, and ask, because we have really, really funky examples that are crazy and off the wall, and then very kind of almost traditional, if you will, if you can say that in natural wine, but like traditional, showings of these wines. So yeah, ask for some help and tell them how adventurous you might be feeling that night. How's the Morgon, Chris?
Well, I'm gonna say a lot of things here. I'll try to pare it down. So we're getting to like the fountainhead of the modern natural wine movement with Marcel Lapierre here. Marcel was, of course, the patriarch. It's now made by Matthew, I think. But this is one of the guys who originally in Beaujolais really took to these natural wine methods, non-interventionist methods. And it is always a gorgeous, this is a wine I buy pretty much every year. It's always gorgeous. I would say in relation to the Gaspard is very pleasant, fruity wine, but it comes off as rustic compared to the Morgon. The texture is much more round and supple and silky, and the tannins are very fine, and there's such a depth of fruit here. It's really gorgeous. And the other interesting thing that the Lapierre does is they will make both sulfured and non-sulfured versions of this wine. And you can always tell. You probably never run across the unsulfured version in the States, but maybe. But they put a little S on the back of the label if it has sulfur, and there's an N on the label if it doesn't, on the back label. So you should be able to find a little S on this one, I'm sure, in the lower left corner. And interestingly, Lapierre, being one of the originators of this modern movement, is not overly fond of the natural wine moniker or strict adherence to no sulfur regimes, even though they make completely unsulfured wines. But he's a total pragmatist when it comes to it, which makes a lot of sense to me. If he sees barrels going awry, and this is one thing you have to do when making wines like this, if you want them to be clean, is taste incessantly and make sure everything's going right. Because once something starts to veer off course, you have to take a corrective measure or not. And that's your choice. So, a big argument would be you're removing one of your great weapons in your arsenal against spoilage in the winery if you don't use sulfur. So, they never put in more than 30 parts per million at bottling. And if something is starting to happen to a barrel, they'll try to intervene in other ways, maybe temperature control, because he's not a strict adherent to that either. But in the end, if he has to, he's gonna dose the barrel with sulfur to keep it from going off. So, you have to be just ultra clean. And this is the other thing. So, like I was saying about biodynamics, the ritual of things keeps things in order and keeps things in line and puts your focus on things. And not using sulfur, you could argue, really focuses you on the quality of the wine all throughout the fermentation and aging process, because you have to watch it. Unless you're okay with tons of volatile acidity or lots of Brett, if you're trying to make a clean, beautiful wine like this Morgon, you have to pay attention and either fix the barrels or cull them, not use them. So pragmatism is not a bad thing in the world of wine. You want to keep that in your back pocket, I think.
Very much so. And I mean, there are stories of years, even in Bordeaux, where you have a potential loss of crop if you don't spray. And there are some that, whether it's because of their certification or just that a strict adherence, won't do it. And that's fine. But I think we just need to keep in mind as a consumer, if we are only buying a wine because of this reason, keep in mind that there's a family behind the wine. There's a person behind that wine making a living off of that. And to ask them to kind of lose that revenue for an entire vintage, or even a large percentage of their crop, say, or in this case, if not adding sulfur throughout winemaking, if something is going awry, you just need to keep that in mind. And I appreciate Marcel Lapierre's that family's pragmatism, for sure. And I think that is something that I'm sure a lot of people do, but we need to keep in mind as consumers that there are people behind the wine here that need to make a living.
Yeah, interestingly, Alicia, that Bordeaux is famous for having problems with rot, and due to humidity. And there's something called Bordeaux mixture, which it's literally named Bordeaux mixture because they use it there a lot, but it's used all over the world.
Which still is permitted, right? In organic,
that's what I was gonna,
biodynamic.
That's what I was going to say. Ironically, this is a spray that is allowed. It's copper sulfate. Yeah. And so, number one, it contains sulfur. Just by the name, you can tell that. And there's some arguments to be made that copper is a heavy metal, but having that, a lot of these natural wine producers are pragmatic enough to realize that if you don't have some of these things beyond your cow dung preparation, or your nettles, or your silicate mixture, you're gonna lose revenue at some point. So yeah, pragmatism definitely comes into it to some extent.
Excellent. Well, let's just briefly, the other kind of terminology here I wanted to get to was kind of that fining and filtering of wine. At the very end, before we bottle, a winemaker has an option to fine and or filter their wine. And fining, they're adding this kind of fining agent to the wine, which will remove or aid in the removal of these kind of colloid materials that are suspended in the wine. And it kind of gathers them all so that it forms this like deposit that's large enough that it will then fall to the bottom of the vessel. So it clarifies the wine by removing all these particles. And some might use, there are different fining agents. There's bentonite clay, there's egg whites, there's gelatins. And you can pick your fining agent kind of based on what you're actually looking to remove in the wine. The argument, against fining is that if you over fine, you risk kind of, stripping elements of the structure and the flavor of the wine, which makes perfect sense. But the argument for is that, of course, it helps kind of stabilize the wine. And we've now touched on this a few times, but this stabilizing wine, kind of giving it a longer shelf life, giving it a potential to age, and making sure that nothing negative kind of happens in the bottle on our shelves or in your home. And then after that kind of fining, you would then opt perhaps for filtration. And you have another option here. As Chris mentioned earlier, you can do a very fine filtration where we're kind of, taking a lot of stuff out, or it can be a rough filtration, and that the size of those pores or, ducts kind of determine what size of particles you're removing. And so you can get into all of that, but that's essentially kind of what that fining and filtration is doing. And the argument is that you take away a lot of the core components of the wine and kind of the expression of it, of the expression of place, and kind of the unique qualities of it by kind of doing these things. Now, we've tasted a couple wines that, kind of just lightly, filter. And so again, doing them in moderation, I think seems to be a good approach. But that's what people are talking about when they say unfined and unfiltered. And so if they're unfiltered, you will notice a kind of a hazier, kind of cloudier style of wine.
Yeah, and likely see a deposit in the bottom of the bottle too, with sediment forming earlier than it would in a wine that had been filtered or fined. And, you know, even outside of the natural wine movement for years, particularly Pinot Noir and Chardonnay producers in the States, so, you know, put that on the front of their label as a badge of, you know, an unmanipulated wine. But yeah, you do have to, I mean, it's no big deal, but you might have a little deposit or a little bit of a haze, you know. And one of the ways you historically, like if you train in wine, you know, looking at clarity and color is historically important, but now everything's out the window. So you can have something quite hazy and have it be acceptable for the style.
Sure. So let's now go to our second to last wine here. We're going to we had the Gaspard Gamay from the Loire. We took a pit stop in Beaujolais to compare, but we're heading back to Loire. Another kind of one of the motherlands, if you will, of natural wine, and an awesome producer here, Beatrice and Pascal Lombar. This is their Chinon, Les Terrasses. So they do, you know, several wines here. They are, I was just on their website earlier today, and just, they, you know, just like looking at photos of people and reading their testimonials, I feel like they're amazing people. And they've been biodynamic since 2000. So yes, while kind of biodynamic farming was kind of first kind of talked about and developed much before that, I still think at 2000, they were ahead of the curve. And, you know, indigenous yeast here, they just do a very light filtering. And they have, if you are looking for a resource, they have just, you know, excellent stuff on their approach to biodynamics. And yeah, they're pruning the vineyard and applying treatments according to the lunar calendar, as we mentioned. They rack the wine, bottle the wine according to the phases of the moon. So again, kind of that holistic and kind of seeing that cosmic relationship. But this, of course, is Cabernet Franc, and I always have a soft spot for Cabernet Franc, and it does not disappoint. I think actually of all the wines we had here tonight, I think this is my favorite. It has all of the rusticity of Chinon that you expect, but it still feels kind of light on its feet. I don't know if you get that, Chris, but there's still kind of a really bright kind of airy quality alongside some of those kind of herbaceous qualities, that kind of whetstone minerality, like crushed gravel even, and kind of those nice kind of dark red fruits. So Chinon, Les Terrasses from Lombar.
It's a super pretty wine. I mean, the nose is flowers and fruit and very subtle pyrazines. You know, it seems like the fruit was relatively ripe here. There's not like a huge blast of bell pepper or herbs, but certainly there's some of that for complexity. And I mean, I'd venture to say that the pH is pretty high. It's a bright, fresh, crisp tasting red. It's gorgeous. This is the kind of thing you definitely want to have some beautiful food with. It'd be great picnic wine in the summer. But it doesn't lack in body either. It has a nice round feel to it. It's quite delicious.
Yep. That kind of the deep brambly berry fruits. They're almost kind of crunchy, adding to the texture. And yeah, this nice kind of medium body, but very fresh. The acid is really lively.
Yeah.
A lot of kind of salivation here as we try and speak after it, but a gorgeous Chinon. And yeah, I mean, you know, some Chinons actually can borderline like on that, the pyrazines of like, oh, is this Carmenere or is this Chinon? You know, it can be pretty intense. But this one present, but you're right, kind of just underpinning the note of complexity for sure.
Yeah, and in my opinion, you never want, for my taste, you don't want to ripen the pyrazines out completely from something like Chinon. You know, you'll see domestic versions of Cabernet Franc that drink pretty much like a Cabernet Sauvignon, you know, when they go into new oak barrels and there's no hint of pyrazine. It's all just massive jammy fruit. But I think you're losing some of the beauty of the varietal character if you ripen it all out. So picking times are pretty important here, for sure. And, you know, they're following the phases of the moon. It's really interesting. So, you know, I can't quite remember, but do you harvest on a full moon, I think? I'm pretty sure you bottle and rack on a waning quarter moon. So, you know.
Yeah, I think the bottling and racking is on a descending,
yeah,
on a descending moon. Yeah,
I think that's when they say that that the natural activities are least active, so you want to manipulate the wine at that point, so as not to disturb the. I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh at it, but it's interesting. But it keeps, like I keep saying, it keeps you focused and doing things in a certain pattern, in a certain way, and in a ritualized way that I think can enhance quality, you know.
Most definitely. And in the end, you know, better and more thoughtful care is being had in the vineyard, and that's the most important thing. When I first started studying wine, I didn't really understand biodynamics and kind of just thought it to be, you know, oh, whatever, it's kind of frou, and I'm not sure that I kind of, you know, believe in that. And though, you know, there are some people that feel that way, but over the years, as you talk to winemakers and kind of learn more, many are just adamant about its effect. And so you can't deny that, and you can't disagree. And so I've really come to appreciate those that are willing to invest the time, the resources, especially that come along with this. You kind of tend to, you know, pay a little bit more for these wines because they're so kind of time and resource heavy, compared to just spraying your land with a bunch of pesticides and killing everything and kind of stripping any kind of beauty out of it, frankly. So yeah, take a look for yourself and kind of read up on it. But you know, talk to winemakers. They're the ones that are in this and can testify to how it's impacted their wines and their grapes as well. So
yeah, I don't think there's any way you can discount the benefits of having a natural living ecosystem in the midst of what would traditionally be a monoculture. And we know monocultures, I mean, realistically, are never very natural or very good. You have to take interventionist steps when you take everything else away. But you know, having cover crops and things that attract predatory insects and you know, a living soil in particular, where there's bacteria and fungus and all of that that's supposed to be there and will interact with plants and allow, you know, it sounds crazy, but the interaction of fungus with the roots of plants is sometimes the thing that allows the absorption of the nutrients they need and the minerals and all of these things. They need like a go-between, and the symbiotic relationship between fungus and plant roots, it's not terribly well understood yet, but it can't be discounted or understated. And again, back just to attention to detail, these people are committed. So dismissing biodynamics is foolish. I take it all with a grain of salt, but see it as a net positive overall. I mean, these people are committed to making the best fruit they possibly can. And when you do that, the end result is the best wine you can possibly get, usually.
Yep. So let's wrap up here, Chris, with something pretty fun. We have, this is from Field Recordings, their Tang. This is a Piquette. It's a relatively kind of low alcohol wine that's made from the second pressings of grape pomace. And this has, you know, origins many, many years ago, and really these were the wines that were enjoyed by kind of the farm workers and the vineyard workers back in the day. This one from Field Recordings from the Central Coast in California, 50% Chenin Blanc, 30% Pinot Gris, and 20% Albarino. So some fun things happening. Chris is going to taste it here. I tasted it in the store kind of a little bit ago, a couple weeks ago. And it was really fun. This is definitely going to be kind of the funkiest of the wines we have on tonight, and the most unique, I'd say. So you'll notice kind of that slight carbonation there. It's not kind of fully sparkling. There we go, but slightly, a little frizzante kind of. But here, Chris, tell us about, well, everything about what you get, but also here we really kind of pick up some of that kind of, if you think about like cider and yeast and those types of aromas, I just remember those being kind of quite pronounced on this wine, alongside some nice funky fruit too.
Yeah, I mean, you can see how cloudy it is. It's definitely not clear. This is kind of a subcategory of the pet nat craze. And like you said, it goes back a long time, but it's really something born out of, frugality and maybe the need to provide a lower alcohol version for your field hands at lunch. You don't want them drinking full strength wine and going back and trying to pick and taking a nap instead. But, it's like grappa, it's a way to use what's left over from the original winemaking process to make something drinkable. And in the case of grappa, you're just distilling the alcohol that's left in the pumice after you've pressed your skins into a brandy. And here you're introducing water back over the pumice. And so really weird. Certainly it's going to be lighter and less concentrated. But yeah, I agree. It's very cider-like. It's quite dry, which is the interesting thing about pet nats is you're using something called the method ancestral, or this is in opposition to the champagne method, but you're literally bottling it, the wine up before it's finished fermenting, and it's gonna finish in the bottle and create the carbon dioxide, and which is why in the champagne method you disgorge and you get rid of the yeast deposit, but here you don't do that. It's akin to bottle conditioned beer or something where there's living yeast in here, and the older the wine gets, the drier it will become. I mean, it depends on how long the producer holds it, but it's possible to drink something like this one day in its evolution, and it will be sweet and lightly fizzy, and then drink it a few weeks later and it will be bone dry and fizzy. But it definitely has a cidery component. And in particular, I would say one thing that reminds me of cider also is I am detecting just a hint of Brettanomyces in this. So it's a little bit funky. And if you drink any Spanish ciders, or even some French ciders, Brett is very, very common in some of these cider styles. So this profile, I think, would really appeal to cider drinkers, or maybe even those who are big fans of the modern sour beer movement, because it definitely has some pretty brisk acidity too.
While Chris enjoys his Piquette there, and don't forget that method ancestral. I mean, that was what was happening in the present day Champagne region originally, before they perfected what is now the traditional method, that they would ferment, and they thought it was done, but really temperatures were dropping, yeast went dormant, they bottled the wine because they thought it was finished, and in the springtime the yeast woke back up and started fermenting again, but this time they're already in bottle, so thus producing that little bit of CO2 and the deposit that is still in there. So again, we're continuing to kind of go back to some kind of ancient techniques, not ancient, but a couple hundred years ago for sure.
Yeah, so it's the continuing theme throughout all of this, is what's old is new again, and I would know if you'd told me 10 years ago that Piquette would be a commercially viable style, I would not have believed you. But here it is, and it fits right into kind of this organic, non-interventionist, and also low alcohol trend that you're seeing these days. So there's no surprise that it's enjoying some popularity at this point.
Right, right. Well, we tasted a lot. We talked a lot. Hopefully this conversation was helpful for you and kind of better understanding what is a natural wine and what we have to offer. So please check it out at your store. Chris, thanks so much.
Thank you. I had a nice time.
What's going to be the one that you're going to continue with tonight?
You know, I might hit that Chinon.
Yep, I was going to say the same. Very good. All right. Well, cheers, everyone. Have a great weekend. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.